Tensions are at an all-time high in Eastern Europe as the Russia-Ukraine conflict intensifies.
CBS News has confirmed the White House has approved a plan to help Americans leave Ukraine if Russia decides to invade its neighbor. This plan comes as Russia begins conducting large-scale joint military exercises with Belarus along the Ukrainian border.
In response, Ukraine is carrying out its own drills in preparation for an attack. All this as NATO troops begin training in nearby Estonia in case foreign intervention is needed. CBS News senior foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata is in Estonia with troops on the ground.
British and Estonian tanks square off against each other in a snowy wasteland not far from the Russian border. NATO partners locked in a simulated battle, with the massive Russian military escalation near Ukraine sending jitters throughout this entire region. These war games have never been more real.
If a conflict were to break out in this region, these are exactly the conditions they'd be dealing with. Deep snow, a difficult terrain, limited visibility against an enemy that far outnumbers these forces in terms of troops and weaponry.
The Baltic states lie right along the borders of Russia and Belarus, each home to a multinational NATO battle group. American reinforcements have been deployed to Poland and Romania, while Moscow has sent tens of thousands of forces to Belarus, part of a massive Russian military buildup. There are still hopes for a diplomatic solution to the crisis in Ukraine, but military preparations are never based on a best-case scenario. Charlie D'Agata, CBS News, Lasna, Estonia.
And CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins us now for more on this. Hi, Nancy. So what more can you tell us about the White House's contingency plan to evacuate Americans from Ukraine if it becomes necessary?
Well, Tanya, I can tell you that our David Martin at the Pentagon has confirmed that the Pentagon has created this evacuation plan, which calls for U.S. troops to set up receiving stations on the border with Ukraine to help process any Americans that might have to flee Ukraine on land. You heard in Charlie D'Agata's package that there are U.S. troops that have been sent to both Poland and Romania. Those are two countries that border Ukraine. And it's interesting because when we asked White House officials about this evacuation plan this morning, take a listen to what they told us. This is verbatim. To be clear, they said, we are not planning for a mass evacuation of American citizens from Ukraine. What does that mean? It means you're not going to see the kinds of airlifts that we saw in Afghanistan last summer, where hundreds of Americans and allies were flown out of the country. The U.S. doesn't have troops in Ukraine. The president says he doesn't intend to put troops in Ukraine. He's very wary of getting bogged down in another conflict so soon after the U.S. has finally left Afghanistan. So that's the reason why you have the president and other White House officials, State Department officials, urging American citizens in Ukraine to leave now if they can and not wait around to see how this conflict plays out.
And Nancy, you'd mentioned the U.S. has deployed troops to support our NATO allies in both Poland and Romania. What's the significance of these two locations in particular?
The significance of these two countries is that they both border Ukraine, but they do not border Russia. So these are two NATO allies, and the U.S. is sworn to protect NATO allies. The U.S. moving troops into position both to help with the evacuation and to send a signal to Russia that the U.S. and other European nations are united against Russian aggression without doing something that could directly provoke Vladimir Putin. If the U.S. were to send troops, let's say, to a country that directly borders Russia, or send troops into Ukraine, which also borders Russia, then Vladimir Putin could use that as a pretext to say, well, I feel threatened, therefore, I'm going to go ahead with my plan to move troops into Ukraine. I have no choice. The U.S. wants to rob him of that opportunity, and that's why they've chosen to send troops instead into two NATO allies that do not border Russia, and that's Poland and Romania.
And Nancy, focusing on Russia for a moment, several top Russian military officials flew to Belarus to participate in a series of large-scale military exercises. Additionally, Russia has started moving military ships into the Black Sea. So what's the White House saying about this, and have there been any breakthroughs in the negotiation process?
Well, the White House says it's more saber rattling and another sign that Putin has every intention of taking this to the brink, and that he hasn't shown any indication yet of backing down, despite multiple talks, not just with President Biden, but this week with the French President, Emmanuel Macron, and other European leaders. So that's why NATO and the U.S. are on such high alert. Yes, it's still possible that Putin could decide not to invade Ukraine, but when he is moving weaponry and troops and military leaders and ships in the ways that you just described, certainly it's an indication that as of now, he is still building up rather than backing down.
Nancy Cordes, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.